thank you for watching Light and Darkness, where today we'll look at the differences between the flesh and the spirit, and it's based on Romans 8:5-6, where it says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." And today we'll look at the first part of that scripture, where it reads, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh." And our title today is Flesh Formed Imprint. And so this scripture, it starts out by showing us that a person has a choice of whether or not to live according to the flesh. And now some people may say that since we're born of the flesh, in a physical aspect, so our choice then therefore is limited by the limitations of our flesh. Therefore we really don't have a choice, have the choice to live according to a spirit, because we're bound by the flesh. However, this scripture it clarifies the difference, that there is a difference between being of flesh and living according to flesh. So with that in mind, or with that assumption given, if there is really a difference between being of flesh and living according to flesh, so then being limited by our flesh, that limitation in itself is actually limited to the aspect of me seeing myself as flesh. So, and then this would therefore, this assumption that being of flesh and living according to flesh, if they really are two separate, let's say, entities, then it would also release or separate living according to flesh from the actual limitation of the flesh itself. If we take that into consideration, this then gives us the option that living outside the boundary of flesh creates a new potential with a new identity. But it reverts back to, or it cycles back to that separation of being of flesh is not the same. There's a difference between being of flesh, or being born into flesh, and living according to flesh. Whereas one, it's not a choice, but the second one is actually a choice that we have and we can make as individuals. So that's the first part of the scripture. The second talks about setting our minds. It says, set their minds on the things of flesh. So the first is that this refers to one that the whole scripture refers to one that's already chosen, that is choosing, and that is continually choosing to live according to the flesh, and therefore carrying out the types of behaviors, or we could see visible attributes of being of flesh. So this is sort of a diagnosis mode, or a diagnosis of the entire scripture itself. But it also talks about, or it clarifies here, that the flesh itself comes with specific attributes. But even these attributes of the flesh itself is different than, or it's separate from the things that are belonging to the flesh. Because the first part of the scripture, it talks about for those who live according to the flesh. Whereas the second part, it talks about setting our minds. So the first thing that we have to do, or the first thing that we are doing, is setting our mind, or living according to the flesh, or setting our mind according to a specific track or a specific path. And in this case, it's talking about the flesh. And by living, we are setting our mind. So what it's saying is that making the choice to live according to the flesh is actually paving the path, or creating a foundation for us to do what? To set our mind. And as soon as we set our mind on the flesh, therefore we continue to behave, or we make choices according to that assumption that we are creating a reality based on the limitations of our flesh. Some again may argue that it's impossible again to be excluded from living according to the, let's say, the constraints of the flesh, because we're born into it. But again, the scripture is separating the being born into flesh and living according to flesh, and therefore it does not contradict the laws of the flesh, or the laws of nature as we call them, but in actuality it supports it, number one, and number two, it separates itself from it, so it doesn't contradict it, and it doesn't limit itself to the necessities of this physical realm that when people first read the scripture, they think that it's contained by that physical element or that physical aspect of it. So it's the point here is that it's clearly separating the physical life from the spiritual life. And really, the point of this first part of the scripture is trying to tell us that the degree of release from the limitation of the flesh, assuming that we've separated this being born into and living according to. So the degree of release from the limitation of the flesh is therefore dependent on what? On the degree of disobedience to living according to the flesh. So the more that I disobey, quote unquote, the limitations of my flesh, once I have come to the realization that being born into and living according to are two different things. So the disobedience of living according to the flesh therefore creates this new opportunity, or this boundaryless potential. And it's really in this boundaryless potential that life exists, or that opportunity can be created, or that a new life can be really paved out for us. But the first aspect, or the first step, is the understanding and the realization that being born into and living according to are two separate entities, or two separate identities. And by coming to that realization, we can therefore look into tapping into this new potential. And my hope for you is to not only tap into this boundaryless potential that there is for you, but in order to do that, there has to be the understanding, or the coming to the realization that you must release yourself from the boundaries of the flesh-formed imprint, which is what this series is called. And by doing that, by releasing from the flesh bound imprint that we're just born into and that we are limited by, and by reaching out to this new potential, and by separating being born into and living according to, that's when we can start to tap into a new potential. And my hope for you is that you will continue to search deeper and continually look for deeper spiritual truths, where God will reveal himself to you more and will really show you what true potential is, and what it really means to be boundaryless in this short time that we have here on earth. Thank you so much for joining me here on Light and Darkness.